politics involved that ultimately, inevitably, still create kind of a unity. And that's what I hear when I turn on the radio, is the product of those bits of disagreement. Some of the favorite moments I've had, our master engineer is here in this room, but I will not point to him, but he's called Doc Adams. Everyone there has a pseudonym because they're terribly paranoid. My name is Marco Maisto, but you could hear me as Dr. Ontology. When our master engineer has left town and the station goes out all of a sudden, that's some of the finest moment in radio that I can hear, when I'm in the middle of a song and the station is dead for half an hour or half a day. It's like, that's real. That's a real thing. So thank you, Doc, for that negligence. And that's what contextualization is for me. It's taking things from their context and putting them into a new context that enriches them and makes a difference. But it is a tacit, if not explicit, act of civil disobedience. And not just for its own sake, although it could be for its own sake, because an act of civil disobedience, I think, doesn't need to be targeted towards a specific cause of any kind. Well, we do what we do in part, if there's to be a political understanding of it all, to be a presence that says this can be done. Because the startup cost by FCC guidelines, if you were to buy the equipment that the FCC requires you purchase, which come from two contractors in this country, is, I believe, well over $5,000. And again, I have the numbers elsewhere, but I believe it's well over $5,000 to open the book. And that's not to talk about licensing, that's not to talk about fees and taxes and things like that. It basically makes communication of the kind that anybody wants to engage in difficult to impossible if you don't have money. And when money is involved, it ceases to become an intellectual freedom, because basically, whether the content that we or some other person or some guy on a bike who has, riding around in the basket of his bicycle a transistor radio broadcasting, whether it's good or bad or whatever, it's still essentially attempting to be a conversation. And a conversation is not a privilege, it's a right, and it's natural, and it's something that everybody should be able to be engaged in. And the idea that you need to have so much money to do that basically affects the content that you will inevitably bring to that conversation. So I guess that kind of sums it up. We're done.
Thank you so much, Marco. Marco Maisto of Pirate Radio. And then we have another distinguished presenter today, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'd like to introduce you to Kembrew McLeod, who is a professor of communications at the University of Iowa, and he's also I think I can call you an activist for copyright reform and Creative Commons licensing. He has copyrighted the phrase freedom of expression as a statement about the chilling effects of current copyright laws in the U.S., and he is also responsible for the film Copyright Criminals, which we saw that clip at the beginning of the event today. So, Kembrew McLeod.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I thought I'd just try and, first of all, be relatively brief so we can have about 10 minutes of Q&A, back and forth dialogue. And so in the next 6 minutes, I'm going to do my best to kind of pull together a lot of things that were said and also add my own perspective. First, I'd like to pick up on your point about the cost of access to be able to engage in dialogue in in a mass culture today. And the startup costs, I mean, that's just the beginning, right? Like just $5,000 just for some of the equipment that's required by FCC. And what's really interesting is, as computer technologies have allowed, have dropped in price software applications that can do increasingly complicated complicated things that have replaced, $10,000, $100,000 machines. It has now put the tools in the hands of more people to be able to engage in dialogues. And by dialogues, I'm talking about whether it could be, radio broadcasts, or it could be by dialogue. I could refer to the art of sampling. That is dialoguing with musical past by, taking old musical conversations and then putting them into new contemporary contexts, like what these guys are doing. And that's great. I mean, it's fantastic, right? Like, more people than ever have access to technologies that allow us to, quote unquote, write or communicate in ways that were really expensive. So, I mean, the really quick history of copyright is, for a couple hundred years, basically, copyright was something that was really esoteric. It was something that none of us, people like us, ever thought about. It was copyright was just the domain of large publishing houses, book publishing houses, television broadcasters, radio networks, etc., that had the capital, the millions of dollars in capital, that gave them the opportunity to broadcast in a kind of one-way mode of communication, broadcast their messages. It wasn't until about 30, 40 years ago, with the advent of the Xerox machine, with the cassette deck, the cassette, and then later home computer technologies, that, copyright suddenly became a concern for more people. It became a concern especially for the companies that made their money off of delivering these messages that we paid for to consume, paid for whether in the context of commercial radio, where we had to hear advertisements, or actually paid for contents like books. But the reason why all the copyright controversies have exploded in the past 10 years especially is because now ordinary people can essentially engage in dialogues with, what are essentially copyrighted contents. Okay, so that's one thing. And every time, another point I wanted to make, and then I'll tie all this together, is every time a new technology comes along, whether it's the phonograph or radio or whatever, it creates, anxieties for the dominant industries. So before the phonograph came along, the music industry that existed was essentially the sheet music industry, selling sheet music. And then the phonograph comes along, and companies like Columbia, which are now suing downloaders, were actually the original copyright pirates, because they were taking the songs published by sheet music publishers and having artists record them and then put them on record. The same is true with radio also. Radio was another original Napster. But back then, 100 years ago, basically, back then, the culture industries and the copyright content industries did not have the same lobbying power that they do today. So basically, we worked out a system so that, first of all, radio could exist. Basically, there's what's called blanket licensing that works on a sliding scale based on whether or not you're a commercial radio station or a non-commercial radio station. And the point is even though these blanket licenses that allow DJs to play whatever song they want, they can still be expensive and out of the reach of, for instance, my colleagues here and myself even. Nevertheless, at least the rates were predictable, and you didn't have to worry about going to the original copyright holders and negotiating for the right to put the needle down on that particular song and play it. And that's a freedom of expression issue. In other words, it gives DJs the freedom to play whatever they want, these blanket licenses, even if it's in a commercial system, fine. Same with what happened exactly 100 years ago when they rewrote the Copyright Act after the advent of the phonograph. Before, it was impossible for cover songs to exist. And by cover songs, I'm talking about Bob Dylan writing Blowin' in the Wind, and then Peter, Paul, and Mary recording it. And 100 years ago, Congress stepped in and said, you know what, basically, obviously this is pre-email and early telephone era. It was pretty much impossible to track down